Hi, Alice here. I'm with Janet, and she has studied perennial peanuts, and that is a wonderful ground cover that is available for use in North Florida and also Central Florida. She's volunteered to show us how she's using it in her yard and is going to share with us the advantages of using a turf grass replacement like perennial peanuts. Janet, tell us what your background is and how you got involved in perennial peanuts and why you decided to put them in your yard.
My background is in horticulture. I have a master's degree in horticulture, and I worked for the United States Department of Agriculture at the Plant Materials Center in Brooksville, Florida, evaluated perennial peanuts and developed several for ground cover use. Also, there's taller growing types which are for forage use, for animal feed. Perennial peanuts are a real true peanut from South America. Most peanuts are perennial. The one that we eat as peanut food is actually an annual. That's kind of an odd one out for that genera of plants. They are a true bean. These particular perennial peanuts, the seeds will be underneath the ground. They will be tiny little things, not like the peanuts that we eat. We plant them using rhizomes, which is the underground stems. They spread from the rhizomes, they spread widely. They've got yellow flowers. Because they're in the bean family, they're highly nutritious. This particular type is planted by rhizomes. There's another type that is available, fully developed in the Hawaii. They grow by the above ground stems, the stolons. It's not one that we recommend as much. Unfortunately, it's not easy to find perennial peanuts. They're not available in the big box stores often. Occasionally you can find them. But in North Florida, I think they're more available than they are here in Central Florida.
I've seen them when I've traveled along the Panhandle and also in North Central Florida, and they're used a lot. The Department of Transportation sometimes plants them in the median, or they'll plant them alongside of the road. I've even seen patches of them in people's yards. There are some farmers up in the county that I live in, which is called Madison, and they have whole fields of perennial peanuts.
The tall growing one.
They bloom and they are breathtaking in that they're just a whole field of beautiful yellow flowers.
They will cut them for hay. They call it the alfalfa of the South because it is that nutritious for animals.
The peanut that we eat, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that it fixes nitrogen in the soil, so it's a form of enriching the soil that you have. Is that the same with this particular species?
Yes, this particular species is called Arecus glabrata. The other one that you eat, the annual one, is Arecus hypogea. They all fix nitrogen. This one is probably not as efficient at fixing nitrogen as the peanuts that they grow for food. They were brought in without their natural bacteria because they couldn't bring in soil when they introduced plants. They're very specific as far as which bacteria they use.
When we say fix nitrogen, could you tell us briefly what that process is and what's required? You mentioned the bacteria.
Yes, if you look on the roots of the members of the bean family, you will find these little lumps on the roots, which are called nodules. And the bacteria that fixes the nitrogen live in those nodules. What they will do is they'll take nitrogen from the air, which we've got a lot of air and nitrogen in the atmosphere, and they will fix it in their form that's available to plants. It's kind of a symbiotic system between the bacteria and the legume.
So they're not really putting it into the ground, they're putting it into the plant?
They fix it for themselves, what is available, like once the bacteria dies, then they release that nitrogen to the soil. And then the plant can take it up because it's widely available to it.
And this, I assume, would be very bioavailable?
Yes.
Bioavailable just for the perennial peanut?
Any plant.
So if you had perennial peanuts in your yard, then could you assume that it would be an enhancement?
It's kind of a system where you probably will not need to fertilize your long grass as much if you've got perennial peanuts growing in with it. I don't fertilize at all.
So tell us a little on the characteristic of the peanut. For example, how tall does it get? How often do you need to mow it? How dense a mat does it form? Does it go well with grass, or will it eventually form a thick mat that it'll replace the turf grass?
It doesn't replace the turf grass, is not in my experience. These particular selections, which are particularly for ground cover use, the one that I've got developed by the USDA Material Center, it only grows 2-3 inches tall, and that is as tall as it will grow. However, the ones you're talking about in North Florida that they're growing for forage, they grow a couple feet tall. They're all the same species, they're just different selections that are selected for different uses. They do spread, they do form a pretty good mat. And some producers have grown these ground cover types as sod, but it's not as good because they don't have the root structure of grasses and the fibrous root structure, so they don't hold together like a grass. They really require mowing. I mow because of the other things that are in my yard. This type of peanut doesn't require mowing at all.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, is it possible to just have these down and not have grass, or are you going to have a problem with weeds?
You're probably going to have other stuff growing in. The good thing about it has been out competing most of my skunk vine weed. And that's a good thing. But I've still got grass out there.
So really, this is not a complete turf replacement. I had thought it was. You're not replacing your turf.
I don't think you would have much luck trying to do that because, like I said, I don't think the growth is dense enough. They do die back in the winter. So you're going to have opportunities for other stuff to come in. Yeah, I don't think it's really suited to just be a complete turf replacement.
Ideally, if you mixed them with grass, what varieties of grass would be best suited to mix with a perennial peanut?
I've got some St. Augustine out there, which was supposedly growing in my yard. I would recommend it with Bahia grass. Bahia is a better grass as far as not needing the inputs, fertilizer and mowing, that the St. Augustine does.
The Bahia, is that the one that puts up the long
Yes,
seed heads? Right. The downside, if you plant Bahia, is that you will have seed heads coming up. And for some people, that bothers them. So they feel that they need to mow it. Well, we have Bahia, and we look at that as a way for it to reseed.
Yes.
And keep improving the amount of Bahia that we have in the yard. I've also seen it has a very long root. My soil is sandy. It's got a little bit of loam, but it's primarily sand. And I think it's pretty sandy here in this part of Central Florida, which is Spring Hill, Zone 9. But the Bahia helps retain your soil, even though it's sand. They help hold it in place so it doesn't wash out.
And they're more drought tolerant. St. Augustine needs a lot more water and inputs.
And more fertilizer.
And more fertilizer. And that's why we would recommend Bahia more. I've got a mixed yard, as we'll see. It's got all sorts of stuff growing in.
Gardening tip, you can add perennial peanuts to your bahia and let the two commingle, and the perennial peanuts will help fertilize because its ability to fix nitrogen in the soil. I've noticed they have little yellow flowers on them. Do you get pollinators to these flowers?
Some, mainly bees more than anything. They're not just covered with pollinators that I've ever seen. The type that's most widely available for ground cover use is one called EcoTurf, which was released by the University of Florida. That's not the one I've got growing in my yard, because the one we had growing at the Plant Materials Center was one called Brooksville 67, but it's commonly called waxy leaf. But I like mine better than EcoTurf, but that's just personal opinion.
Recently, there's been additional research through the University of Florida to develop 3 new varieties that are going to be coming to market in 2025 and beyond. These are based on surveys of consumers and landscape people. Consumers like to see flowers. They don't want to do mowing, what the availability will be. Sometimes they are only available commercially or it's harder to get. But as that information becomes available, we'll be able to share it with you.
Because you cannot plant them from seed, which is what everybody asks me when they walk by. I just see that no, they have to be planted through vegetative means, through the rhizomes. And that's why they are not widely available. They're a good plant. They're not native to Florida, but they're Florida-friendly type plants. And because they do not produce seed above the ground, they spread from the rhizomes, but they can only usually go so far from the rhizomes. It's not like they can spread into wild areas. They can't go into a wild area that's down the road from you.
Oh, in your yard they can become aggressive, but not in the whole neighborhood. Now, my experience, I planted a few of them, and one thing I learned was I didn't plant them in what I think is probably the ideal place, because it does have partial shade more than I thought. What would you say the ideal location is for these plants?
Full sun, usually. They will take a little bit of shade, but not very much. And they do not like wet soils. They have to be well-drained soils.
So if you've got kind of a boggy, soggy area, this is not the plant.
No, absolutely not.
And what if you have a watering system that comes on twice a week? Is that a problem?
No, it's not usually. I can only run mine once a week. Don't plant them on a real clayey soil. They just will not do well.
Gardening tip, if you don't have a soil test, get a soil test for the area where you're considering putting in perennial peanuts or any kind of ground cover, so you know if your soil meets what the requirements are for the plant. And if you plant it in the wrong place, which would be the wrong soil and the wrong sun, like I did, then your plant isn't going to thrive.
They are slow growing. You're not going to get a yard like mine in a year or two. I planted them maybe 12 years ago or more, and that's why they're so thick. It just takes time.
Well, I have noticed that since we've had some storms and I've lost a little bit of the canopy, my yard is becoming more sunny now. 2.5 years, I'm starting to see a little bit of runners spreading out. Started with 6 plants. It's an experiment. I wanted to see if it would fill in the area, then added 4 more plants. Those plants have disappeared. Again, it was the wrong place for this plant. This is where the Florida-friendly right plant, right place, you got to pay attention to these things because it does make a difference. You've got to know your soil, you've got to know your sun, and you've got to know the watering, what's available, and what the plant needs, and you match, and you have a successful garden. What your yard looks like, how about we go take a look? Okay.
We're late in the year, so they're not flowering very much. Because my yard is so well established and has so many peanuts in it, they don't flower quite as much as where the plants are spreading. These are the yellow flowers, and these flowers are edible. They look like little bean flowers, which they are.
Here, let's see.
And just like your normal garden peas and beans, they've got the little keel in the middle with the little flags on the outside. I rarely see too many pollinators. Most of our plants that are visited a lot by pollinators are plants that are native to here. This one's called waxy leaves. They've got multiple leaflets.
So this looks pretty dense. I can see a little grass sticking up.
And some weeds.
But easy to mow. This is nice and thick, and what a rich looking color to your yard. You've got it all the way to the street.
Yes.
And then you've got it all the way across into your neighbor's yard next door. I can see the little blossoms.
You don't see them on the other side of the driveway because
they can't cross the driveway. They've moved on over. So they do spread, but this represents 12 years. You planted them on the other side of the driveway. If they cross over, you have them all along your fence, and they're moving. If you want a ground cover, it's nice to have one that is low maintenance, take care of itself, self-fertilizing. It's fairly drought tolerant.
Oh yes, very drought tolerant.
And it will slowly spread. When it's established, it has this beautiful matte and deep green color. You can see the weeds have a lighter color in contrast to your perennial peanuts. He said they're about 3 inches. That's how high.
They don't get much higher than this. The flowers get up higher than the foliage does.
So what do you set your lawnmower at?
Mine's at least 3.5 inches.
It just kind of skims the...
Right. I don't believe in scalping my lawn. And because I technically have a bit of St. Augustine in it, you don't mow that very low.
Right. I remember when we had a St. Augustine lawn, it was 4 inches.
Unfortunately, most commercial mowers around here do not do that. They scalp it.
Gardening tip. If you're working with professional lawnmower or somebody who's local mowing your yard, tell them to set their blade at least 3 to 4 inches. So there's no need to set it down at 2.5.
Which is what most of them do, unfortunately.
Yeah. And in the heat of the summer down here, and when we're in midst of drought, it doesn't make sense to cut your yard down to 2.5 inches.
No, it surely doesn't, because it stresses the grass.
And if you want to know about gardening and recommendations for lawns and growing grass, contact your local extension. They have all the information on the best species of grass to plant for the zones that you're living in. They also have recommendations on how much to fertilize, what kind of fertilizer to use, and what depth the grass should be kept when it's mowed.
And in counties like Hernando County, where they have restrictions on when you can fertilize. You do not fertilize during the rainy season because the nutrients wash into the groundwater, which is not good for anybody.
That's the tip. Contact your local extension, get current research and recommendations. There are a lot of free webinars and podcasts available, all designed for homeowners so that you can be successful growing a healthy Florida yard.